Thank you for having me. So I'm going to talk about how to appeal for more financial aid for college and how to improve the likelihood of a successful appeal. Some of the key takeaways are going to be what is a special circumstance, what is the good grounds for an appeal, and how to write the financial aid appeal letter. Okay. So let's start with what a financial aid appeal is. It may sound obvious, but let's get a few points across first. When you appeal for more financial aid, it is not a negotiation where you're trying to bargain with the college to get more financial aid. It's not like going into a car dealership where you can use bluff and bluster to get you a bigger or better deal. Instead, it depends on providing the college with special circumstances, things that distinguish you from the typical family or things that have changed within the last 2 years that affect your ability to pay for college. And most importantly, you have to provide documentation of these special circumstances because the entire process runs off of documentation. If you don't provide the documentation, they're going to ask you for it later. And it is based on your ability to pay, your family finances, not the student's academic performance. We'll talk about merit aid in a subsequent slide, but a financial aid appeal is about need-based financial aid, not merit-based financial aid. So you'd send this to the financial aid office, whereas merit aid is usually sent to the admissions office or the office of the president. And colleges have a lot of different names for a financial aid appeal. Some will call it a professional judgment review, or a special circumstances review, or a financial aid appeal. So why should you appeal for more financial aid? I mean, clearly, if your ability to pay for college is affected by some special circumstances, you're going to need more money to afford a college. I mean, the financial aid packages are already pretty harsh, but when you are affected by special circumstances that aren't considered in the standard formula, it's going to make it even more difficult to afford to pay for college. So the most common examples are going to be things like your income changed, there's an unusual family financial circumstance like special needs children or an elderly parent, or a cash flow challenge. And so what you want to look for is if the expected family contribution that comes out of the financial aid formula is not just really harsh, but completely unrealistic, completely unreasonable, that's usually a sign that you need to appeal. Or if there's been a recent change in your family's financial circumstances, like job loss, that's another sign that you need to appeal. And if you can't afford the college, even with the financial aid, then you need to appeal for more financial aid. Another potential sign of the need for an appeal is if you have two different colleges that, not that they're giving you different amounts of financial aid, because most colleges will give you a different amount of financial aid, even a different amount of grants, but rather if the net price, when you subtract the gift aid, the grants and scholarships from the cost of attendance, if that is different significantly between two colleges that are of similar wealth and similar financial strength, then that may be a sign that you might need to appeal, because maybe one of them knows about your special circumstances and the other doesn't. For example, some colleges use the CSS profile form as opposed to the Fafsa for awarding their own financial aid. And so the profile form asks about special circumstances and other appealable items. The Fafsa doesn't. So that college may know about your unusual circumstance, whereas the other one might not. And it's also important to emphasize that colleges generally don't get into bidding wars for students. In fact, some of them will only review an appeal for financial aid based on another college offering you more money if that college is similarly selective. For example, Cornell has stated publicly that it only looks at Ivy League colleges, Stanford, Duke, and MIT, in terms of looking at their award letters that are substantially different. That's who they consider to be their competitors. They're not going to look at a better award letter from your local public high school, local public college. So, and the gist here is the FAFSA is a one-size-fits-all form and doesn't have a question about whether you're affected by special circumstances. So you need to speak up if your family's ability to pay for college is affected by special circumstances. And frankly, the worst that can happen is they say no. So there's no reason not to appeal if you have special circumstances. So when should you appeal for more financial aid? At any point in the academic year. And it could be now when you're towards the end of the academic year if you're already in college. It can be when you apply for financial aid for the first time, or each year when you apply for financial aid. Whenever your circumstances are affected by something unusual, a difference, that's the time to appeal. So job loss, well, the day after you lose your job, appeal for more aid. And special circumstances can include a pandemic like the coronavirus pandemic. So that the Department of Education has given guidance to that effect that the colleges should consider people who are affected by the pandemic as a special circumstance. Doesn't mean that they'll make an adjustment, just that they can make an adjustment. And you want to try to appeal as soon as possible because colleges have contingency funds in their financial aid budgets to handle appeals. But if you wait until later, that money may have already run out, so that may mean that you're going to get more loans but not more grants, whereas you appeal earlier, you may get more grants as opposed to just loans. And an appeal is just for 1 year, so if the circumstance is ongoing, you're going to need to appeal every single year. So how do you go about appealing for more financial aid? First step is you call the financial aid office or send them email asking them what is their appeals process. Some colleges are going to ask you to fill out a form. They have a semi-standardized form because they want to do a holistic review, and the form will ask about the most common types of special circumstances. So they'll have particular questions designed to get at the insights that they need. Others are going to ask you to write a letter that summarizes your special circumstances. Usually it's best to have it in a form of a bulleted list with each bullet summarizing the special circumstance and the financial impact on the family. And you need to attach copies, not originals, of documentation of the special circumstances and their financial impact. That is, the process is driven by documentation. Without documentation, they don't have any proof of the special circumstance. The U.S. Department of Education requires them to provide the documentation in the student's file, so they're not going to make an adjustment in response to an appeal unless they have that documentation. Mail the letter and the documentation and any required forms to the college's financial aid office, and you should send it by some kind of proof of mailing, so delivery confirmation or certified mail, return receipt requested. And then about a week after you send it, call the financial aid office to make sure they received it, because sometimes it's received by a mail room that doesn't get to the financial aid office, and also to ask them if they need any additional information. So it's not just you're checking up to make sure they received it, you're also saying, well, is there any other information you need me to provide? Now, when you're writing this letter, you want to keep it short. 1 page is ideal, 2 pages if you need the space. Don't do a 20-page letter where you tell your entire life story. They won't read it. In fact, they probably will only read the first 2 pages. start just by asking for financial aid appeal or professional judgment review. You want to tell them this letter is about an appeal so that they know that this isn't someone sending them a thank you letter, that this is someone who's asking for their help. And then have that bulleted list where each bullet summarizes the special circumstances that affect your ability to pay and the financial impact of that special circumstance on the family. Job loss, for example, would be your income dropped from a certain amount to another amount. That's a certain amount reduction. Spell out each step. And only do one special circumstance per bullet. And it's a good idea to also mention the attached layoff notice so that they know which piece of documentation corresponds to that special circumstance. And the reason why I say special circumstance is because when it rains, it pours. Usually families have more than one special circumstance at a time. Like someone who is got a serious illness may have also lost their job because of that. And number one mistake that some people make is to ask for a specific dollar amount. Because if the amount that you're asking for is less than what they calculate you should be getting in additional aid, they're going to give you what you asked for instead of the higher amount. So the only thing asking for a specific amount of money can do is reduce the amount of aid that you get if they accept your appeal. And there is no appeal beyond the college financial aid administrator. You can't appeal to the college president. You can't appeal to the U.S. Department of Education. They will simply refer you back to the financial aid administrator because by law, it is only the financial aid administrator who can make an adjustment. So be polite. Don't be demanding. Just ask for their help. And include your contact information, the student's name, and other identifiers in the appeal letter so that they know who's appealing for more aid. I've seen some appeal letters that forgot to put in this information and they just signed the letter Dave, and the college financial aid administrator said, well, which Dave? We've got lots of them at the school. So let's get into what is and isn't a special circumstance. So first of all, it has a financial impact. And I've seen lots of special circumstance letters where the special circumstances don't actually have a financial impact on the family. Well, that may provide some context, but get to the heart of the matter, which is the circumstances that affect your ability to pay for college, ones that have a financial impact on the family. And that can include changes from the base year, which is the prior year. It's 2-year-old income information to the current year. So that could be job loss, salary reduction, furloughs, other things like that. And oftentimes, because the Fafsa is based on the prior year, sometimes the families will have already filed their tax returns, not just for the prior year, but also for the current year, or at least know what their income is. And when that income is lower, they often will appeal. And so that leads to slightly higher rates of appeal. But the college financial aid administrators will base the adjustment not necessarily on the current year, but maybe on the academic year, an estimate of the academic year income. Because if you lose your job and then 2 months later you get a new job, even though your income, total income this year was lower, your income next year will be, assuming that your new job continues, it'll be whatever your monthly salary is times 12. And in addition to differences from the base year to the present, there's also differences between your family and the typical family. So that could include high dependent care costs for a special needs child or an elderly parent. Someone needs maybe 24/7 nursing care. That can be very expensive. If the parents themselves are enrolled in college, on the Fafsa, you can only list children who are enrolled in college. But what if the parents go back to school at the same time? That is a valid special circumstance. If you have high unreimbursed medical or dental expenses, and also in general, they tend to be one-time events that are not reflective of your ability to pay during the academic year. So maybe you had an unusual bonus this year. That's not going to be repeated next year. or you had an inheritance. Your aunt's salary doesn't die every single year. My apologies to anybody whose aunt's salary actually died. And as I noted before, when it rains, it pours. It is not uncommon for families to be affected by multiple special circumstances at the same time. So what isn't a special circumstance? The financial aid formulas are focused on mandatory, non-discretionary expenses. So a discretionary lifestyle choice is not going to be a good way of justifying an appeal. So if you're having trouble making your boat payments, they're not going to make an adjustment unless your boat payments are on a houseboat and you live in that houseboat and you don't have another residence. But they're looking for situations that were mainly something that wasn't under your control. The main exception is when the student quits a job to go back to school full-time because they couldn't both work a full-time job and go to school full-time. That is a discretionary choice, but it's one that it's not uncommon for colleges to make an adjustment. There are also routine expenses like vacation expenses, charitable contributions or tithing expenses, your rent, your mortgage, your HOA, insurance, car payments, credit card bills, just routine housing maintenance and plowing and grass cutting and the like. Netflix may seem to you like it's an absolute necessity, but it's a discretionary choice. Even internet access, which is more justifiable as a necessity, may be something that they don't make an adjustment for. Though, because of the pandemic, with students having to go home and to the switch to online education, internet access is actually now a necessity. And if you don't have internet access at home, that is a valid professional judgment appeal item. And there's another aspect of special circumstances where you know that something might happen in the future. College financial aid administrators are reluctant to make adjustments for anything that is not yet actual but speculative. So if you know one of your parents is going to retire this coming year, well, that hasn't happened yet. On the other hand, if the parents are divorced and the child support ends when that child turns 18, which is next year, that is definitive, deterministic, and therefore it is an appealable item. And it doesn't hurt to ask for these additional items, just realize that they may not make an adjustment if it's not a special circumstance. So the main types of special circumstances include if either the student or parent's income has changed. I mean, obviously, if it's increased, you're not getting more aid, but if it's decreased, you are, potentially. If there are unusual expenses, like that dependent care costs, changes in assets, they're less likely to have an impact because the Fafsa looks at a snapshot as of the date you file the Fafsa. But you filed the Fafsa and then in the next month your assets went down by 35%, well, maybe that's justifiable and maybe the college will consider it. If you have another family member or other demographic variables have changed, that may be an appealable item. One-time events that are not reflective of your ability to pay during the award year, the academic year. And if you've been affected by the coronavirus pandemic, like the student or parent's employer has closed, laying off or furloughing staff, parent, God forbid, dies of the coronavirus, or someone's been infected with the coronavirus and they've been hospitalized and so they've lost wages because they are not able to work from a hospital bed, and you've been exposed and you're quarantined, you can't work, or you can't work because of the shelter-in-place orders. Knowledge workers can work from home via computer, But if you're a construction worker, it's very hard to do that from home. And with when the colleges told students to vacate the dormitories and go home, they may have costs with returning home and shipping or storing their belongings, or maybe they don't have a home to go to, or maybe there's a reason why they can't go home. Maybe a hostile home environment, or maybe one of their parents has coronavirus and the student does want to get infected, or maybe one of the parents, his immune system is suppressed. Maybe they're undergoing chemotherapy for cancer and the student doesn't want to risk hurting their parents. Because after all, the first 2 weeks that you have coronavirus, you may not be symptomatic. Some people are never symptomatic, yet can still transmit the infection. And obviously, if your college goes from face-to-face education to online education, and you didn't already have a computer or internet access, you might need to get that, and so that's valid special circumstances. I included in the slide the actual statutory language, which they include some statutory examples of special circumstances. And I've emphasized that it's changes in a family's income, the assets, or student status, anything that differentiates you from a typical set of students. But I'm going to skip over this slide and list the statutory examples. If you have a sibling that's going to a private school, that is usually considered a special circumstance. Some colleges may cap the amount of the adjustment for that. And some will say, well, it costs the state only $8,000 or $10,000 to educate a student, so we're not going to pay for the amounts beyond that that are more of a discretionary choice. Like if it's a private high school that charges $50,000 a year, they may not make that kind of an adjustment. The statute also says unreimbursed medical, dental, or nursing home expenses, high child care or dependent care costs, someone lost a job, dislocated worker is another type of job loss. If the parents are enrolled at least half-time and pursuing a college degree, if the student is homeless or at risk of homelessness, income from foreclosure, bankruptcy, forfeiture, or a liquidation, especially of a family farm, and also special needs disability-related expenses. The most common ones that colleges see are, first and foremost, job loss or a decrease in income. And that has the biggest impact on the family's ability to pay for college. When the parents get divorced, that is also an example of a special circumstance if it occurs after the Fafsa has been filed, because if it occurs before the Fafsa is filed, the Fafsa will reflect it. But also other things related to that, like the end of child support or Social Security benefit payments for the child. That's a common example. If either of the parent dies, that can have a financial impact. If you have disabled children, autistic children, Down syndrome children, that can have, and children with severe medical conditions, that can have an impact on the family's finances. And you might have a high income, but most of that's going to take care of your child. They need to take that into account, but the only way they know about it is if you appeal. Now, sometimes the family's home has been destroyed in fire, tornado, or other natural disaster. Normally, the family home is not reported as an asset on the Fafsa. And so colleges will be a little bit reluctant to make an adjustment for something that's not reported on the Fafsa. But they recognize that when you lose your home, you lose all your belongings, and you have suffer other expenses. So what they sometimes will do is they'll try to give you the benefit of the doubt on other items because of this, that they really don't feel comfortable making an adjustment for something that isn't affecting your financial aid in the first place. Something that families need to know is that the colleges, they have an allowance for book supplies and equipment in their official college cost budget. It's an allowance, it's an estimate, it's an average, but your textbook costs may be much higher. So you should keep receipts, and if they exceed the amount of the allowance, appeal to the college for an increase in the cost of attendance to reflect the higher costs. I mean, I've seen colleges that have allowances of just $250 for textbooks for an entire year when one physics textbook can cost more than that. Also, there's something called a dependency override, which is the student can be a dependent or an independent student. There are some circumstances in which the student should be considered to be an independent student. The college has the authority to make that change, but it's usually in very severe circumstances, and I'll discuss that a little bit. And I already mentioned the end of child support and end of alimony payments and Social Security benefits. That's a change, might be expected in the coming year, but that affects the family's ability to pay for college. So a couple other examples, and I'm going to run through these pretty quickly. When you convert a regular traditional IRA into a Roth IRA, that shows up on your tax return as income, but that's not really income that's available to you to spend. It's assuming it all went into that Roth IRA. So what you can appeal that, and there is specific guidance from the Department of Education to college financial aid administrators saying it's okay to make that adjustment. Not every college will. The U.S. Department of Education can't tell the colleges what they should and should not do, but they can say it's okay if you do this. If you have unusual capital gains, you sold a bunch of stocks to pay tuition, and that artificially increased your income. You can try appealing. Sometimes they'll make an adjustment. If the parent was called to active duty in the U.S. Armed Forces, that can affect their income, and jury duty can affect their income. That's something potentially worth appealing. If you had no job and you had to take a hardship distribution from a retirement plan because you needed to buy groceries, it shows up as income on your tax return, but that's not really reflective of your ability to pay, especially if the retirement plans are at zero now. So that's something that you can appeal based on. And again, they're looking for things that were involuntary in nature primarily, but there are some discretionary choices where and you could argue that really was involuntary or that they should make an adjustment regardless. So adequate documentation that's the phrase in the statute. Ideally, it should be independent third-party documentation. So not a letter from your parents saying that you need more money, but from some other source that is independent and objective. So, for example, you lose your job, a copy of your layoff notice or a letter from the unemployment office showing that you were receiving unemployment benefits, those are good documentation of the job loss. Just stating that you lost your job, that's not necessarily as good. But sometimes you have no choice but to write a letter in which you summarize certain circumstances. Receipts like medical or dental bills if you had unusually high medical expenses. If your assets have changed significantly, copies of all your monthly statements. If it's a hostile home environment, the student's trying for a dependency override, law enforcement or other police reports, court protection from abuse orders. And also, if there's someone who is familiar with this situation, like social workers, clergy, school counselors, teachers, doctors, they can write a letter, and that can be, because it's a hand's-length letter, it's not someone who has a personal vested interest in you're getting more money, but rather a professional. That helps. Now, when the colleges get these appeals, the way that if they decide that the circumstances justify an adjustment, what they do is they take a particular data element on the Fafsa, which one depends on the nature of the special circumstance. But for example, if I change an income would be implemented by they're changing the income on the Fafsa. You shouldn't do it, you should let them do it because that's their job. And if you do it, you're going to be subjected to verification and discrepant information, and they will be less likely to make that adjustment after they correct the change and then consider your appeal. And so they make the changes to the data elements on the FAFSA, push it through the formula to yield a new expected family contribution. That new EFC is subtracted from the cost to yield a new financial need. The financial aid is then based on that new financial need. So the increase in your financial aid will be related to the increase in financial need. And that will yield a new financial aid package. Now, sometimes the increase in financial aid will be entirely loans. Sometimes it will be part grants, part loans. Sometimes it will be entirely grants. A lot depends on the college's individual financial aid packaging philosophy. And they will take all factors into account. So if you lost your job but you just won the Powerball jackpot, they're going to take both pieces of information into account. Okay. Now, the way in which they look at a change in income is, first of all, they're going to want to figure out whether that change in income was just temporary or permanent. Now, if your income varies significantly from one year to the next, and this is not uncommon with self-employed individuals, you're a small business owner or a waiter or a taxi driver, you're a realtor and seasonal farm worker, your income is going to go up and down from one year to the next. And so what the colleges will tend to do in that situation is they'll ask you for several years' worth of tax returns. First thing they're going to do is look at these to see if there's a trend. And if your income is steadily decreasing, maybe they will use the lowest income. Or if it just goes up and down, they might use an average. Now, if your income is steady, it's just there's a big change from 2 years ago to the present, what they can use any 12-month period that they think is appropriate. What they often do is they look at what is your income going to be during the calendar year in which the academic year starts. Because they use calendar years because that's verifiable based on tax returns. And even if they have just 1 month's salary, 1 month pay stubs for that new job, that they can multiply that by 12. Okay. Now, with medical expenses, it gets a little complicated. First of all, they're only going to look at unreimbursed medical and dental expenses. If you've got expenses that are covered by insurance, they'll subtract that insurance from it. They will consider, though, the premiums that you pay, as well as your co-pays and deductibles, or if it's a medical expense that isn't covered by insurance. Now, they are going to focus on medically necessary expenses, so it's an expense that's paid for prevention or alleviation or treatment of a physical or mental defect or illness. They don't look at over-the-counter medications that aren't prescribed, vitamins, herbal remedies. They don't look at that. And if it's cosmetic surgery, they may not look at that, but a lot depends on whether it is considered necessary or not. Reconstruction after a mastectomy for cancer, that's considered to be necessary. There's actually a federal law that states that requires health insurance companies to cover that. But if it's just to make you look better, they may be more hesitant to make an adjustment for that. But it depends. It's got to be expenses for people, not pets. I know that they're a member of your family, but they don't get counted on the FAFSA. And even if you needed emergency surgery for your pet, it doesn't get treated as a special circumstance. And they're also going to look at, did you get a tax credit or deduction on your federal income tax return for medical or dental expenses, such as there are a few tax credits. And then it gets even more complicated. There's something on the FAFSA's formula behind the scenes called an income protection allowance, or IPA. And it already includes a bit of an allowance for medical and dental expenses. 11% of this IPA is for medical and dental expenses. So what they will do is they will subtract that from your unreimbursed medical expenses to yield how much that adjustment might be. And some colleges do a different method. Some will base it on only the expenses that exceed 7.5% of AGI, figuring that if you could deduct it on your federal income tax return, then maybe they will consider it, but otherwise not. It's not big enough to justify it. Now, we mentioned dependency overrides before, and there are some appeals based on a change in dependency status. So first of all, it's not dependency status like it is on the tax returns. The Fafsa uses a complete other definition. And the main impact of dependent versus independent is that dependent students have to report parent income and assets on the Fafsa. Independent students don't, but they might have to report a spouse's information. There is a total of 13 dependency status questions on the Fafsa. If you answer yes to any of them, you're automatically independent. Otherwise, you're dependent. But there are some circumstances in which the college may grant a dependency override. You may have heard that if you don't claim your child on your tax return for 2 years and the child earns at least $4,000 a year, they can be independent. That has not been the case since 1992 when it was repealed, and it was repealed because it was abused. Now, sometimes families say, well, my child is paying for all their expenses. They're financially independent, financially self-sufficient. They don't live with us. We don't claim them as an exemption on our tax return. Or maybe, and because of that, the parents want to have nothing to do with the child. They don't complete the FAFSA. They don't pay for college, or they don't even live in the U.S. None of these, on its own or in combination, is sufficient for dependency override. Now, just to run through the dependency status criteria on the FAFSA, if they're over age 24, married, a graduate student, they have dependents like a child, they're a veteran or serving on active duty in the U.S. Armed Forces. After they reach age 13, they were an orphan in foster care or ward of the court. Court-ordered emancipated minor status. That is being declared by a court to be an adult prior to reaching the age of majority. It has nothing to do with emancipation on a divorce decree, which is when the child reaches the age of majority. Two different concepts, but they're often confused. Court-ordered legal guardianship. This one is going to be subjected to a lot of scrutiny because there's been recent abuse of it, and the colleges are going to want to see evidence that it really is genuine and not just someone filing court documents to get their child more financial aid. They'll be especially suspicious of legal guardianships that occur 1 month before the child reaches the age of majority. Someone who is homeless or self-supporting and at risk of homelessness. Now let's get into dependency overrides. A student is independent if the college makes a documented determination of independent student status by reason of unusual circumstances. For the other types of appeals, it's special circumstances. Here they use the word unusual. They are rare. Dependency overrides do not happen very often. And just because the parents don't want to pay for college and they refuse to complete the FAFSA, that's not enough justification. Examples, generally it involves a complete dissolution of the family. So cases are domestic abuse or sexual abuse against the child, court protection from abuse orders against the parents. If the parents are both incarcerated, hospitalized, or institutionalized. If there's a lot of documentation that the home is not safe for the child to be there. Also, abandonment. Now, you might think, oh, the parents just dumped the child on the streets. Well, that sometimes happens. But more often what happens is the child's parents are divorced. The child is living with the mother, say, and a new stepfather, and the mother dies. The child hasn't heard from their biological father in over a decade. They don't even know where they are. That's considered to be abandonment, because technically the step-parent, even if they step up after the mother dies, is not considered a parent on the FAFSA. And they're considered a parent only for as long as they're married to the custodial parent. When that custodial parent's no longer in the picture, I mean, their contributions to the child get reported as untaxed income to the child, but otherwise they don't count as a parent on the FAFSA. If the parents and whereabouts are completely unknown. So we talked before, this was all about need-based financial aid. What about trying to get more merit aid? I mean, trying to tell them that your child is wonderful and deserves more money from the school. Now, first of all, when a college offers merit scholarships, that's a recruiting tool. It's not a need-based tool. So it's not, usually doesn't come out of the financial aid office, but out of the admissions office. And just like financial aid is formulaic for need-based financial aid, merit-based aid is often also formulaic. They may require a minimum high school GPA, certain admissions test scores, a class rank. And let's say that and they usually base it off of the application for admission. So let's say that you fell short of these thresholds. They required a 1400 SAT and you had 1380. But if you retake the SATs and you get 1400 or better, well, then you could try appealing to the admissions office, especially if the decision day hasn't yet arrived, to ask them, well, we now satisfy the requirements, and could you give us some merit aid? And because they're trying to recruit students who have strong academic performance, they might very well make you eligible for it at that point in time. And that's comparison with the thresholds. So an appeal will be successful if you've had significant improvement in academic performance, or if the student has done something so extraordinary that the college absolutely has to have this student. And we're not talking about a student who got a minor award. We're talking about a U.S. Olympic athlete or a student who ranked #1 in the country in a competition, or a student who happened to cure cancer. You may think that's far-fetched, but there was indeed one student that I'm aware of who worked in a lab and came up with a novel approach to curing colon cancer. Multiple pathways. I won't get into too much detail about that, but she was amazing. Right. I wrote the book on how to appeal for more college financial aid, and you can find it on Amazon. But the thing I want to point out is that on my website for the book, I have a free tip sheet that you can download. It's in PDF format on how to appeal for more financial aid. It's one page. It gets the essence of everything. And here's what it looks like. And it talks about how to do it, the special circumstances. You'll also be able to get the slides from this presentation. We'll email them out to everybody. So don't worry if you weren't able to scribble down everything as I was going through the slides very quickly. I was trying to reserve enough time so that we can answer all the questions that were asked. So that is the end of the talk, and we're now going to open it up to questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. Really appreciate all your insight. I'm sure the panelists or the attendees do as well. So we got a lot of questions to go over. For those who submitted questions, I'm going to try to go through as many as possible, but if we don't get to your question, we do plan to write some content on this. Check out savingforcollege.com for more information. We have absolutely answered a lot of these questions at some point in this presentation or in other articles we've written, and we plan to write a lot more. So kicking it off, we had one person early on in the talk ask, all of this talk about financial aid appeals, do they also apply to people who did not qualify to file the Fafsa, someone who doesn't have any financial aid, for example?
All right. So usually the college will want to see someone file the Fafsa before they will consider an appeal, because the appeal is relative to the information that came from the Fafsa. And without that kind of information about the family income and assets, it's more difficult for them. But let's say that your family didn't think it needed any financial aid because they were wealthy, and then both parents happened to lose their job. I saw this a lot in 2008 after the previous economic downturn. Well, at that point in time, you appeal for more financial aid. Don't be surprised if the college asks you to submit the Fafsa so that they can then consider the appeal relative to that Fafsa. So you submit it based on the 2-year-old income information, which is pre-pandemic. Then they get an EFC based on that. They will then make changes in the income to reflect the changes in the family's financial circumstances. That'll yield a new EFC, and then they'll award aid based on that. The financial aid appeal process, except for the subjectivity of determining whether the special circumstance justifies an adjustment, is largely formulaic. It's only that one bit that is subjective.
Cool. Thank you, Mark. We got another question here. The NACAC/DOJ event was likely to affect college aid policies. How do you think COVID will exacerbate that?
Okay, so NACAC was subject to a 2-year antitrust review by the U.S. Department of Justice because they had a policy that all their members had to sign on to that led to things like the May 1st National Candidates Reply Date, which more popularly is known as Decision Day, that all the students had to respond by that date. Well, officially that date no longer exists, though most colleges are still adhering to it. But they were also objecting to anti-competitive. So there's a possibility that some colleges may become a little bit more competitive, especially for the most talented students or for the wealthiest students, and that there may be attempts to get students who have already committed to a college by May 1st to change their decision after May 1st. So we may see a little bit of this, not at the top tier schools, but maybe at the second tier or third tier schools. With regard to coronavirus, there is incredible pressure on the colleges, not just because of the need to give refunds for room and board, and maybe, I don't think likely, for tuition. There's also a likelihood that the college enrollments will drop by as much as 10 or 20% this fall. Partly, new international students may not be able to get to the U.S., or they may not want to go to college in the most infected country in the world. Domestic students may be deciding to go to college closer to home, and maybe not a public four-year college, but perhaps a community college, because they don't want to be paying huge amounts of money for watching videos all day through online education as opposed to getting the real college freshman year experience. Or they may decide to take a gap year to wait out the pandemic. And also current students may take a leave of absence to wait out the pandemic. So the colleges are going to have enrollment declines, which affects them financially because they have less tuition revenue. So already we've seen a few colleges promise that their tuition is going to go up in the fall. It may eventually go up a few years from now because that's not uncommon after an economic downturn. But at least for the fall, these colleges have announced the tuition is not going to change. But I think this year it's going to be an easier year to get accepted off of the waiting list, because I think a lot of the colleges are going to have to turn to their waiting list when they don't get as many students accepting the offers of admission as they have in previous years. And if they don't make their enrollment numbers, they're going to need to try to get more students.
Got it. And we had 3 questions that were basically along the same lines, essentially about rental income. So there's some people who depend on rental income that's very variable. They're basically working at like a break-even point between expenses and that income. Others who have a lot of rental income but not a lot of labor income, and they're wondering, is that a reason for appeal? Can someone appeal based on the fact that their rental income is more variable, and are they expected to sell this rental income if the appeal process doesn't work for them?
Right. So you're not obligated to sell rental property or your family home, but if your rental income is volatile, or it's, let's say you own a bed and breakfast or an inn and nobody is coming because of the pandemic, certainly it's an appealable item. Your income has changed. So you should certainly appeal if you're affected in that way.
Got it. And then another person asked, any value in supplying comparative cost of living if high at home, for example, in the SF Bay Area, versus much lower at the college location, for example, in rural Kentucky?
Yes. The colleges that use the CSS profile form, that has built in some adjustments for regional cost of living adjustments. It's also, those colleges do consider the net worth of the family home, but more of them have started saying we're not going to consider it, or we're going to cap it at a multiple of the family income, because someone could have a home in San Francisco that they bought 30 years ago before the home values appreciated so much. And, excuse me. And the value of the home may have outstripped the family income. And so, yes, they have this big asset that someone who is living in Kentucky or Pittsburgh doesn't have, because home values are much cheaper there. But so some colleges saying, okay, we're going to start ignoring this, because it all it does is prevent middle-income families from being able to afford to go to this college. So that is certainly one thing. You'd be surprised, though, that the regional cost of living differences other than for housing don't actually make that much of a difference in the amount of financial aid you receive.
Got it. We have somebody else who asked, if I quitted my job and started a new business, is this a good special circumstance?
Yeah, so if it changes your income, even though it was a discretionary choice, it does have a real impact on your ability to pay, and so that is something that's worthwhile asking the college to review. Some will make an adjustment, some won't.
Got it. We have another person asking, my husband worked a lot of overtime last year, but not this year. Is this also a special circumstance?
Yes, and because it's a change in income. It was an unusual increase in income. Now, remember, the Fafsa is based on the prior year, so the 2021-22 academic year, that financial aid is based on 2019 income. So yes, in 2019 you had unusual high income. Maybe you had a big bonus, or maybe you worked a lot of overtime, and you're not going to have that this year, especially with the pandemic causing 26 million people to lose their jobs, and other employers are doing furloughing their staff or doing pay cuts. 10% pay cut is not unusual this year. And yes, that is something that you should definitely appeal on.
A very similar question, Mark. Someone asked, does retirement from work, does that also constitute a special circumstance?
Yes, if you've reached normal retirement age and you've decided to retire, or maybe health issues force you to retire, that is justifiable. If you voluntarily retired at age 40, part of the FIRE movement, you're going to not necessarily get an adjustment because you could work, but colleges review these on a case-by-case basis, so who knows what might happen. But normal retirement age, yes, much more likely to make an adjustment, especially if you've already retired. If you're talking about possibly retiring next year, remember, they want not speculative changes, but actual changes. So they'll say, well, when you've actually retired, let us know, and then we'll make the adjustment.
Got it. A very particular circumstance here. Someone asked, are universities allowed to consider an applicant's past and future pledged giving history and overall volunteer history with the school when awarding institutional aid?
No. Remember, I talked about charitable contributions and tithing as examples of things that aren't special circumstances. Colleges won't consider that because it's considered voluntary. Even if it's part of your religious practice to give 10% of your income to charity, the colleges don't consider that.
Got it. And just to be clear, he was referring to the pledge history to the university. So like giving donations to the university, and he gave basically $20,000 to his alma mater 20 years ago, but is now facing financial strain. Do you think the appeals process is going to be more favorable to him?
No, they wouldn't take that into account.
Okay. Another one here, they're asking, I plan to ask for clarification, review, because of a significant difference in the net price between 3 competitive private New York state colleges. Is it unusual or unreasonable for me to request this adjustment given that one of these 3 colleges is giving out an award that's $4,000 less?
Certainly you can ask, and oftentimes when there is a big difference among several competitive colleges, it may be a sign that that college had information that wasn't available to the other 2 colleges. Though it could also be that that college is wealthier than the other 2 colleges and just gives a more generous financial aid package. And you certainly can share the award letters with the college and ask them, why did this other college give you so much more money, yielding a much lower net price than they did. It also helps in these appeal letters if you let the college know that this is what's preventing you from enrolling at the college. Now, don't say that to every college, because colleges will sometimes call each other and compare notes. But if it genuinely is the college that you want to attend, but you can't see how to make ends meet, but you have this other college that is much more affordable, it doesn't hurt to ask. Be polite about it. Some colleges will respond, good luck at that other college. Others might make an adjustment, especially if they consider that college to be one of their peer group with whom they compete for students.
And then another quick question here. What happens if the non-custodial parent refuses to do the CSS profile?
The first thing, first of all, let the college know. I mean, colleges do have the ability to say, we'll waive that requirement, but they're going to want to see evidence that there really is a genuinely hostile relationship. In fact, what they may do is the college financial aid administrator may call up the non-custodial parent and listen to them. They don't like to get in between the parents, but they will call them up and to ask and to make it clear to them that just by completing the form doesn't mean they're obligated to pay anything. But also, non-custodial parents may be worried that the custodial parent will get access to their income and asset information, and the colleges can reassure them about the privacy, that they only reveal the financial information of one parent to that parent. They don't do it to the other parent when the parents are divorced. And if they receive a subpoena, which sometimes happens, they will notify the parent with sufficient time so that they can get that subpoena quashed.
Got it. We also have somebody asking, my son attends a community college, received an email stating that he qualifies for the emergency grant. Upon calling that, they said it was an error that he has to apply for this grant, no one giving guidance on applying. What do you suggest should be the next step?
All right, so some colleges are just giving a flat amount to all their students. Some of them have an application process. Find out from the college what they're doing. Look on their website. Sometimes they have a coronavirus page where they have announcements. Some of the colleges haven't figured this out yet. Some haven't yet drawn down the money. Only about half have drawn down the money from the U.S. Department of Education. Some will never draw down the money because they're concerned about some of the conditions that have been placed on the money. But certainly ask and find out what's going to be available to them and how they need to get it.
Great. Well, we're sitting right at 5 p.m. I know we have somewhere around 30 questions still outstanding. So we're going to have to end this webinar here. But like I said, Mark is going to be writing some more material on these questions. We got a lot of great ideas from users, from readers. So keep submitting these questions if you have them. And Mark, I'll let you end off with some final notes if you have any.
Right. So, and what we will do is we'll write an article in which we answer many of the questions that haven't yet been answered. So it'll be answers to questions about financial aid appeals, or an article like that, and we will post that on our website. We anonymize all the information, so don't worry about private information getting out. And so submit questions, and we will get to them. And we're going to do the most we can to try to help people navigate this process.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Mark. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And stay tuned for more from us. We're going to be sending out a post-webinar email to everyone with the recording, the slides, and some more information on how to get your questions answered. Thanks, everyone.